What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rantin Review Entertainment. We're talking today about X-Men 97, the latest Disney Plus animated series, part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, kind of, sort of, but also harkening back to the old 1990s X-Men, the animated series, a series that I, as a Gen Xer, grew up with and absolutely loved. Now, we're going to review episodes 1 and 2 that are currently out on Disney Plus. And I'm going to give my thoughts on it and not only how they adapted the story and how they updated it for today, but also the story itself, which is far more interesting than I thought it was going to be. But before we get into that, I want to remind you guys that, as always, YouTube loves that algorithm. So if you enjoy videos like this, please hit the like button. And while you're down there, you might as well hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Hit it with an adamantium claw. Blast it with one of your psionic blasts, whatever it is that you want to do. It does help the YouTube algorithm let other people know about this video. I appreciate it very much. But back to X-Men 97. So, as I mentioned, the X-Men 90s animated series is much beloved. Well, at least the first 4 seasons are. From my generation, Generation X. We came up with those in the 90s. They were groundbreaking for not the animation, which was pretty choppy, even in the good episodes in the first 4 seasons, and then the horrible animation that Saban cheaply got in season 5. But it was mostly about the themes and the storytelling, which was fantastic. It was also a series that introduced kind of this continuous expanded universe where one story would lead into another story, and you had multiple plots going on that would then culminate in the season finale, a tactic that we would see later on used in the 2010s with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is kind of based off of that same idea. This is all something that Chris Claremont, who was the writer for the X-Men series at the time that is emulated here by the X-Men animated series, came about and really introduced some of the best stories in the history of the X-Men franchise, many of which they put in the animated series. The animated series was supposed to end up with season 4. It got commissioned for a 5th season, and we don't need to talk much about that 5th season, but it did end with apparently Charles Xavier being blasted with this weapon that over-enhanced his mutant abilities and was basically killing him. In order to try to save Xavier's life, he was taken off planet by his soulmate from across the stars, Lalandra, and the Shi'ar Empire, out to space to try to find a way to cure him from the illness that was basically killing him. But it effectively meant that he was leaving Earth and leaving the X-Men, and that's where the original animated series ended. We pick up in 1997, which is the year after the animated series in canon ends, and amazingly enough, they have done an outstanding job at adapting this. I will say this from the jump. When I heard about this coming back, I was of course initially excited because, like I said, the X-Men animated series, for most Gen Xers who were into comic books and sci-fi and stuff like that, that was the MCU for us back then. We didn't have anything else. Everything else was kind of like cheaply done Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movies, or really bad Superman sequels, or really bad Batman sequels. But we had the X-Men animated series that did like the comic book stuff right. It was the only thing we really had. Well, that and Batman the animated series and the Spider-Man series. But X-Men the animated series really broke the ground for that, and the great stories that they told there. So I was really kind of worried, considering how bad some of the MCU and some of Disney's handling of a lot of sci-fi, fantasy, comic book franchises have been over the last couple of years, that they were going to do it on a crappy way. They were going to change characters in ways and make them characters that they weren't before, and that they were going to invoke a lot of modern day political messaging in something that was, well, from a different era. And I'm happy to say that I really don't have to worry about too much of it. There are some subtle things here and there, but they're subtle, as which they should be, because the main focus is not on that. It's on what the X-Men story is, which already has a lot of political tones to it. For those of you who don't know, the X-Men pretty much is an allegory about minorities coming out in mass culture. And the X-Men franchise, its mutant powers, they basically turn being a superhero into kind of like being a minority. So if you had a mutant power, either you were born with it, you were born looking really different, like some of the more physically mutated humans, or most of the time it comes across in puberty, which is kind of the allegory about being gay and lesbian, which comes out in puberty. And the whole thing was that the X-Men and the other mutants in this series and in this universe, that's just how they were born. That's how who they were. And they face a lot of opposition from regular humans, Homo sapiens, and they call themselves Homo superiors. The Homo sapiens, us, the regular people, the normies, at first we're very afraid of them. Some people were sympathetic to them. And that's where we kind of pick up here. We're going back to the Friends of Humanity, which is kind of this extreme kind of Ku Klux Klan group that is really kind of anti-mutant. And it does echo a lot of those civil rights era issues. But again, I'm saying civil rights. This is more civil rights than it is like what you would call woke now. So we pick up with that, which was the main storyline in the first 2 seasons of the original animated series. There is this new young kid who he's a rich kid and he's got powers, but we never really see the powers until the very end of episode 1. And much like the first original season of the X-Men franchise, when it was Jubilee who was being hunted and she was just discovering her mutant powers, same thing's going on with this guy. Him and Jubilee do kind of have a kind of partnership because there is that allusion to them, and there's a lot of echoes back to the first ever episode of the animated series in this first episode of X-Men 97, even down to the way they introduce all of the heroes and all of the X-Men, to the way that the kid is kind of like a fish out of water, and he doesn't really want to be part of this, and he doesn't become part of this. He kind of bows out of it because he's a Gen Xer, and us Gen Xers as teenagers in the 90s, we really didn't want to get involved in all the crazy stuff. We were just like, leave me alone, let me do my thing. Meanwhile, we also have the updated storyline from after the aftermath of Charles Xavier leaving, and Cyclops is feeling a little bit overwhelmed about being the new leader. He doesn't know if he can do the right job. We also find out that Jean Grey is pregnant, which is kind of crazy. I was like, oh, well, those of us who know some comic book lore know where that's going. So, and it can go in a number of different ways, and that's probably going to play out throughout the rest of the season. We do catch up also that Rogue and Gambit, who've been kind of on again, off again with their no-touch relationship through the original series, they seem to be kind of on again. It's kind of like they're a couple in the first couple episodes until certain things happen. Beast is still Beast. We don't get much with him. Wolverine is classic Wolverine with some great lines, but we haven't really gotten into anything involving his story. The focus is really on the Friends of Humanity and them trying to track down this new mutant kid. I should probably stop calling him young man. It's Sunspot. But anyway, so he winds up leaving after all the adventures of the first episode. And it was in the first episode that I really understood that they understood what made the X-Men animated series great. The conflict between the characters. You still got Wolverine and Cyclops barking at each other. And we have some new characters. Bishop, who was the time-traveling space jockey, as Wolverine used to call him, he's now part of the group. That did happen at the end of the original series. And Morph is back, and now Morph is looking like more like his comic book self with kind of that pale skin. And Morph is one of the favorite characters from the original series that originally wasn't even a real X-Men character. They just made him for the series just to kill off a character in the first episode, and the character became popular so much so that he's now canon to the entire X-Men universe. I liked how they got us the first fight with the Sentinels. You brought back the familiar. Boulevard Trask is at it again. They had to go back and go through a lot of things to find out why the Friends of Humanity had Sentinel-like weapons and why they had a Sentinel arm. And that leads us to find out that Master Mold has been recreated when Jean Grey does a psychic dive to find out what's really going on and who's really doing what. It is during the psychic dive, though, that we do see our first batch of Easter eggs and mysteries for the series. One of which being that there's a Smoke character who's talking to her. She sees that there's somebody else interfering with her psychic link as she's trying to find these answers. And it leads us to this kind of apocalyptic, almost Terminator 2 scene of Sarah Connor getting blown away by a nuclear blast kind of a moment. She's really upset by this, doesn't know what's going on. The audience, we don't really know what's going on, but they kind of start hinting at what storyline they're adapting later on in the series. It does end with the X-Men having this awesome fight. By the way, the animation is so much better than it used to be, and this show, which always suffered from kind of inconsistent animation. Some of the animation in the original series was really good, but a lot of it was kind of bad. They really put the budget into this one and made the animation good. And the fight sequence in this one with the Sentinels, it was pure 90s X-Men animated series. It was absolutely fantastic. I will note some other things in here as well, as they kind of hint that there might be a little bit more nuance to this show than even the original show had. Trask has brought back Master Mold, which kind of doesn't make any sense since Master Mold, the original AI, turned on him and wanted to swap out brains for computers or whatever. But regardless of that, Trask actually explains the reason finally why him and a lot of the humans that are against the mutants and the X-Men do what they do. He finally expresses that it's out of fear. Now, we always kind of knew that, but they never really kind of had any of the characters say that. They were just kind of one-note bad guy bigoted characters. But he's telling Cyclops, he's like, you don't know what it's like to be on the outside of evolution or something. Like, you're going, like, humans are going, like him, are going to be extinct, and you're going to take over. You guys are the future. We're going to be extinct, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. And of course, Cyclops, obviously counters this by saying, yeah, but what you're doing is ridiculous. That's kind of a ridiculous way to handle it. Humans and mutants can work together, and as even Master Mold said in the original series, mutants are humans. You're all the same thing. So it's like, but it's interesting that they did this in not only this episode, but in the second episode where I believe it was Executioner who was also fighting with Scott, and he was going on. He's like, well, you know what it really is? It's not so much that you're different. It's all the complaint. For him, it was all the whining. Humans have it hard too. You guys act like you're the only ones who have it hard. Humans have it hard too. We don't whine about it. It's the whining. So it's like, I mean, misguided as it is, I kind of now understand the point that they're making instead of them just being one-dimensional bad guys. You know what I mean? So, but again, the show does a wonderful job of presenting that as nuance, but also presenting characters like Cyclops and later on Magneto, kind of countering it and going, yeah, we understand that, but what you're doing is wrong. It's the wrong thing. You make yourselves the villains by what you're doing. We understand your fear, but that's misguided, and you're causing problems where they don't need to be none. So, speaking of Magneto, we will get to that now. At the end, after all this stuff has happened with the Sentinels and they've taken out the new Master Mold, the X-Men go back to the mansion and find out that Magneto is there, and that in Charles Xavier's will, Charles left all of his money, the mansion, and the X-Men to Magneto, which in episode 2 causes Cyclops to have some problems. He's like, what, did Xavier not trust me? And he's feeling bad about it. I'd also like the way that they're giving, the animated series always did give Cyclops a lot more than any of the movies or any other adaptations have done with Cyclops. But I mean, even Morph kind of jokes about it in one scene in the first episode, how Cyclops is the most boring man on the planet. But he really isn't. Cyclops is a really good character, and I like seeing the fact that they're giving him some depth that has not been, that character hasn't had in any of the movies since they've done the original animated series. So anyway, Jean is still upset, and she's trying to convince Cyclops that they should leave the X-Men and go off and have their kid and try to live somewhat of a normal life as much as they can. Wolverine feels this, and he's sad because he knows that Jeanie's going to leave. You know how he feels about Jean Grey. And this kind of all is taken, it's kind of subtly in the back because there's a new problem now, because now that Magneto is in charge of the X-Men, the UN and everybody is coming after him because, remember, Magneto was not a good guy. He's not a white hat. He's killed a lot of people and caused a lot of damage and done a lot of mess. The last time we saw him in the animated series, he tried to lead a worldwide revolt against humanity, made Asteroid M that almost wiped out the whole planet. So, yeah, him showing up again, even though he saved the kid on the Ferris wheel, people want blood because he's killed a lot of people, so rightfully so. So he turns himself in, trying to adhere to Xavier's wish, even though you still feel that there's a little bit more of that anger in him. He still would rather just kind of dominate. And this brings up a point that a lot of people may or may not know about the X-Men, is that the relationship between Charles Xavier and Magneto is very reminiscent from that time period in the 60s of Xavier being more like Martin Luther King Jr. and Magneto being a little bit more like Malcolm X. And if those who did study Malcolm X know that later on in Malcolm's life, Brother Malcolm did kind of soft on his more militant stances, and that's kind of what you're seeing somewhat paralleled here with Magneto. And this episode was absolutely fantastic. He goes on trial at the UN. The X-Men are there to kind of back him up and try to keep him from doing any shenanigans. Meanwhile, Wolverine's back at home at the mansion with Jean Grey, who's trying to stay out of this stuff. But Jean Grey's water breaks, and Wolverine, of all people, has to drive Jean Grey. It was the greatest scene when she's like, he's coming. And Wolverine's like, who, Apocalypse? And she's like, the baby. And Wolverine's like, oh. So he's like driving through the streets in the Jeep, almost running over people. Jean Grey's trying to like psychically move everybody out of the way so Wolverine doesn't run over them, trying to get her to the hospital. They get to the hospital. Of course, the hospital person is a bigot and doesn't want to, and this is an allusion to what used to happen back in the day with minorities when they would go to the hospital when they were pregnant, and you would go to a hospital, and if you weren't white, they would say, hey, we don't give birth to your kind here, kind of thing. So it is an allusion back to that. God, it's so weird that stuff was actually real, but this is one of the good things about not being forcefully preachy, but actually using things that did happen, is that those things did happen and they would happen to a mutant. So that is kind of counter, because Rogue is there. She kind of takes over the Doctor's knowledge by touching him and absorbing his powers and his knowledge, and they wind up giving birth to Jean Grey. This has to call Cyclops away, however, who, while this is all going on, is in the middle of this battle that breaks out because the Friends of Humanity can't stand the trial. They think that the UN has turned their back on them, and then Magneto's kind of laughing. He's like, isn't it funny how, you guys try to play it straight, and the people you're supposed to support, they turn against you. I've seen some people say that this is a parallel to the January 6th thing, and I don't want... It may be, the writers may have meant to do that, they may have not meant to do that. I didn't think about it, because I remember this entire scenario actually came from the comics, so you think of it what you will. If you want to inject it in there, you can go ahead. But we didn't see the Executioner show up, and then and now the Executioner, if you don't know his character, he's a human who's adapted all this technology and has studied the X-Men, so he knows the weaknesses. He knows the weaknesses of Cyclops to go for the eyes. He knows the weaknesses of all the other X-Men. So he's trying to do this, and he's kind of a formidable force against them. Scott gets called away because Jean is having the kid. So it's really up to Magneto and Storm to kind of protect not only Magneto, but to protect the United Nations Council. This guy gets in there. Magneto's trying to control his powers. Storm is being the goddess that she is. And then all of a sudden, this guy's got this anti-mutant gun that he shoots. He's aiming for Magneto. But again, this is straight out of the comics. But it was a different character that Storm jumped in front of. Storm jumps in front of Magneto. She gets hit, and her powers are gone. It's a variation on the Genosha collars, but it doesn't need the collar. It takes the same power, amplifies it to not only temporarily suspend a mutant's powers, but to get rid of them altogether. And Magneto has had it. And you think he's about to lose it and kill everybody, but he winds up taking the UN Council. He winds up taking the Executioner, and they go up in the upper atmosphere. It gets kind of cold, and he's basically doing this to show them, like, look, that's what I see. Charles wanted me to do this. I'm trying very hard to follow what Charles wanted to do, as much as I want to just step on all of you, and I could. But look at that planet. We all deserve to live there. Everybody deserves a place, because it's one place, one common goal, one common future. We all are sharing this planet, and we all deserve to be able to live on it in peace. And it's everything in him not to kill these people. But in doing so, not killing them, he proves his point. He's exonerated, and he once again shows that what Charles Xavier wanted to do, even though it was the harder road, it was the better road than him, just because he could have just slaughtered all of them and then reignited a mutant human war. But instead of that, he gained another level of peace. So it did prove out right. In the midst of all this, in the aftermath of it, we do have Cyclops and Jean now thinking, hey, maybe we can leave. Storm, however, who doesn't have her powers now, she does leave the X-Men, and she quietly leaves a note that lets Jean Grey read it to the rest of the team, who are all in tears because, Storm, she's OG. She's one of the most beloved X-Men not only with the fans, but within the universe itself. So she's gone off. Gambit then overhears the fact that Magneto and Rogue apparently have had a history that I was not aware of in the original series, and I don't think it was. They're adapting something else from an alternate universe in the comics that Rogue and Magneto had a past. And we find out that Magneto, his magnetic abilities allows him to counteract Rogue's, and Magneto is the only man that can touch Rogue. And Gambit kind of overhears this, and so there's going to be a problem. Gambit and Magneto are going to have a real issue, and that's going to be the real love triangle. I think they're kind of steering away from Jean, Wolverine, and Cyclops being the main love triangle in the series, even though there's still some of that there. And I think the big triangle is going to be Magneto, Gambit, and Rogue, which I'm really curious to see how they're going to play that one off. That's going to be really entertaining. And then we end with another crazy cliffhanger. The end of all this, Morph is just like, you know what? Storm's gonna come back, and she'll hang out with the normies for the day. Then she'll want to come back. The doorbell rings. She's like, I told you, she's already back. He goes to the door, opens it up, and it's Jean Grey. But Jean Grey is already there, and she just had Scott's kid. And oh my God, I think they're doing the storyline. Now there is a storyline in the comics. There's several of them, but there's one in particular where it turns out that Cyclops had his whole relationship with somebody who looked like Jean Grey, but was not Jean Grey. And they're doing they're switching it up a little bit here, but if that's the storyline they're doing, we're in for a wild ride for the rest of this season. Plus, if they're also doing this storyline where Storm loses her powers, that's a great storyline from the comic book. And we haven't even touched on anything with Wolverine or with Beast or anything like that yet, and their personal storylines. But there's a lot that they packed into these first 2 episodes, and I'm amazed. I went into this hoping that it would at least be good and it wouldn't be too stupid, but it has exceeded my expectations. They have knocked it out of the park, at least in the first 2 episodes, from the animation, the storytelling, keeping it feeling like X-Men, not making it something that it isn't. And I gotta say, man, so far so good with X-Men 97. I'm very curious to see what the rest of the series is going to bring us. Lots of mysteries they've already opened up. Who is the cloud person that Jean saw in her vision? Who is this other Jean Grey? Is it who we think it is? For those of us who know what the history of the comics is, what's going to happen with Gambit, Rogue, and Magneto? Or are the Friends Against Humanity going to really have any kind of say? Are they going to continue to be a problem? And obviously we know, and we've seen already hinted, that Morph and Mr. Sinister, that's not over with. And we also know that the Phoenix, there's something with the Phoenix, because they alluded to it. They even had it in one of the intros. Something's going on there. We really don't know yet, but I'm going to be curious, like the rest of us are going to be, to find out what happens here. But I want to know what you guys think. What did you think of X-Men 97? Do you think they nailed it? Do you think that they could have done a little bit better here or there? Or do you think it's total trash? I think it was great. I'm pleasantly surprised. They exceeded my expectations. But again, let me know what you guys think in the comment box below. Until next time, I will see you guys here for more news, rumors, and reviews on the Rantin Review Entertainment. Have a good day.